In an earlier lesson, we created some object instances, but really glossed over the details of what's actually happening. In this lesson, we'll talk about how objects are created and initialized. Objective-C has no formal notion of constructors. Instead, it relies on standard methods to create and initialize an object. It does so through a two-stage creation pattern. First, the class method alloc is called, and this is used to allocate memory for an object. The default implementation provided by NSObject is sufficient in almost all cases. We then call the init method, which initializes that object and puts it into a valid state. We often override the default initializer or add additional initializers to our custom objects to simplify their creation. Despite the fact that Objective-C doesn't have a formal notion of constructors and instead relies on these standard methods to create object instances, you really should treat initializers as if they were constructors. The init method should really only be called once, and calling it more than once will likely cause bad things to happen. The signature for the default init method returns an ID type. Objective-C provides dynamic typing, so the ID type is used to indicate that a valid object type is being returned. However, the type of return is almost always a pointer to the specific class type we're working with. Let's look at a basic implementation of init. So I'll switch over to my artist.m class, and I'm going to override the default init method. So this is an instance method that returns a type ID. Init takes no arguments. Now, class has two implicit references available to it. There's one called self, and this is how we refer to our self. So if we wanted to access additional methods from within our class, we would do so through the self reference. We can also refer to the superclass through the super reference. So if we ever need to explicitly call a method directly on the superclass, we can do so through that super reference. So the first line of code in most init methods is going to be the initialization of our self reference. So we would say self, and we call the superclass version of init. We then test to make sure that self was properly initialized. We can do whatever custom initialization we need to do here. And then finally we return that self pointer. If I didn't explicitly override the init method, the basic implementation would look something like this. Now, in addition to the default init method, we can also create additional initializers that can simplify our object creation. As a general rule of thumb, an object should always be created in a valid state. So it's often best to add additional initializers that help us meet that requirement. For instance, when we created an instance of the artist class, the first thing we did was called its setName method to ensure that it was in a valid state. It would really be better to provide the name at the time the object was created. So we can do that by creating a custom init method. Let's create a new initializer called initWithName. Since this is a custom init method, I'm going to switch over to my header class and add a prototype definition for this. We'll call this initWithName. This will take a string argument. And I will copy that. And switch over to my implementation and add the implementation of this. So I want to begin by first initializing the self reference. So I'll call a superclass init method. Test to make sure that was properly initialized. And then I want to take that argument that came in and write that to my _name instance variable. We'll copy this reference just like we did within our setName method. So this provides us with a custom initWithName initializer. We'll switch over to mainapp.m and take advantage of this. So I can replace my implementation of alloc init with alloc initWithName. And we'll call this the Beatles. And we'll delete the line of code where we're setting the name. We'll also delete the line where we were appending that string. And run our app. And there we go. So a much more convenient way of initializing the artist instance. Another common pattern is to provide what are considered convenience initializers. This is a class method that combines the allocation and initialization into a single method and returns an auto-released instance. We'll see many examples of this pattern throughout the Cocoa frameworks, and we can add our own convenience initializers as well. Let's create a class method called artistWithName to provide this behavior. So I'll switch back to artist, and this time I'll create a class method called artistWithName. Take a string. So in this case, I will return a new instance of my class, artist, and I will call my initWithName initializer. And then I want to return an auto-released version of this class. so I can combine all three of those calls into a single line of code. Now I can switch back to my main app.m, and I'll replace this altogether. One additional change I will need to make here is, since this is returning an auto-released instance, I don't need to explicitly release this instance at the end. So I can delete this artist release call. I'll run my code again. And there we go, the same behavior that we had before. But this time we have a much nicer interface. We don't have to worry about the explicit memory management, and frankly the code I think just reads better than it did previously. You should now understand how objects are created and initialized in Objective-C. I recommend you add custom initializers to improve your object's API and ensure they're in a valid state after initialization. Additionally, I recommend adding convenience initializers where appropriate, as they can simplify memory management and improve the readability of your code.